CNF, the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, is sponsored by Goucher College's Master of Fine Arts in Nonfiction. The Goucher MFA is a 2-year low-residency program. Online classes let you learn from anywhere, while on-campus residencies allow you to hone your craft with accomplished mentors who have Pulitzer Prizes and best-selling books to their names. The program boasts a nationwide network of students, faculty, and alumni, which has published 140 books and counting. You'll get opportunities to meet literary agents and learn the ins and outs of the publishing journey. Visit goucher.edu/nonfiction to start your journey now. Take your writing to the next level and go from hopeful to published in Goucher's MFA program for creative nonfiction. Well, speaking of that, CNF is also brought to you by Bay Path University. Discover your story. Bay Path University is the first and only university to offer a no-residency, fully accredited MFA focusing exclusively on creative nonfiction. Attend full or part-time from anywhere in the world. In the Bay Path MFA, you'll find small online classes and a dynamic and supportive community. You'll master techniques of good writing from acclaimed authors and editors. Learn about publishing and teaching through professional internships, and complete a master's thesis that will form the foundation for your memoir or collection of personal essays. Special elective courses include contemporary women's stories, travel and food writing, family histories, spiritual writing, and an optional week-long summer residency in Ireland, with guest writers including Andre Dubus III, Anne Hood, Mia Gallagher, and others. Start dates in late August and January. Find out more at baypath.edu/MFA. Well, CNFers, you must be this tall to riff. It never gets old. It never gets old. All right, well, Chuck Klosterman is here. If you haven't read some of his work over the past 20 years, then we're going to have words. He's got a new book out, his first collection of short stories called Raised in Captivity, Fictional Nonfiction. But wait, Brendan, I thought this was a nonfiction podcast. Shut up. It doesn't matter. When it's Chuck Klosterman, especially when he's written hundreds of thousands of nonfiction words, and this new collection of fiction is written like nonfiction, he gets to come on the show. This is CNF, the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, where I speak to badass writers, filmmakers, radio producers, and podcasters about the art and craft of telling true stories. He fits into that for sure. There might be some newbies taking out a room in the CNF Hotel this week. Welcome. This is how we roll in these parts. You can head over to BrendanO'Mara.com, for show notes and to subscribe to the podcast kick-ass monthly newsletter. I give out book recommendations, essay recommendations, fun stuff. Once a month, no spam, can't beat it. As always, keep the conversation going, keep it alive. On Twitter, at CNFPod, Instagram too, at CNFPod, Facebook, wherever. Tag me in the show and I'll jump in the fire with you, baby. Consider leaving a kind review, why not? Why not? A few more poured in as birthday gifts, and I dig that, man. Means the world to me. Like I said, I'd love to reach 100 for no other reason than I'd like to reach 100. Nothing will change, but I think it'll look pretty damn cool. You know how I often ask guests where they feel most alive and engaged in the process. I get that feeling when I'm in the pocket talking to these CNFers, like Chuck, of course, who I was sort of freaking out about and probably did too much research, which led to me feeling a bit scrambled. But, take the other morning. It was this past week, date of which is inconsequential and meaningless. I had an early interview. Someone's on the East Coast. I had to get up, ass crack over here in Western Oregon, and had to get up early to record. I wasn't necessarily feeling it. I slept like shit the night before. But when I got in the pocket and I was reading the defense, man, I was jacked up. It felt good to get to that moment. I've been super stressed with this new job, and I feel very detached from this show. I haven't had the energy to really promote and engage on social and even record interviews. I've exhausted my backlog of what I had in the can, so things are going to be challenging going forward. But the podcast has felt like kind of like this phantom limb in a way. So I don't know what I'm trying to say. I guess just getting in front of this mic and talking to you, talking to people like Chuck and Allie Rowbottom, it makes me come alive. And I think you'll dig this conversation with Chuck. He's written 11 books. He's been the ethicist for the New York Times. He's written cover stories for Esquire and GQ. He wrote for Grantland. He appears on Bill Simmons' podcast with lunar regularity. Was even parodied in The Onion. I mean, geez. So yeah, here's me and Chuck Klosterman, episode 160. Yeah.
Oh, good. I mean, I sometimes people will. It's odd, I'll get asked to do extremely small podcasts from people who just seem to be like saying, "I'm going to just roll the bones and see if it'll happen." But the bigger podcasts, not that often. It's 5 years ago I got asked more. Not much anymore.
That surprises me, given LA when your last book came out. But what if we're wrong? I mean, it's like you're on Comedy Central and Daily Show, CBS, and all that. So and here I am thinking like all these people want to get their teeth into you. But that surprises me that they're not knocking on the door quite as often.
Well, that's a little different because that's like 3 weeks when the book is coming out, with a publicist sort of pushing me to these places.
Yeah.
For the most part, I'm just kind of sitting at home. And, I think like some people think I still live in New York. Some people still think I live in North Dakota. It's always interesting to me.
Huh. Yeah. Being able to, what kind of a luxury is that for you or a handicap if as a writer to be able to mainly kind of just sit at home? Someone who was, identified as a journalist early on in your career, and now you can kind of just, sit in your own press box, so to speak.
Well, I mean, how much is an advantage to it? It's an advantage to my life. I'll never know if it's an advantage or a disadvantage to my career. I mean, maybe, I live a pretty insular life now. I mean, I really do. There are many days where my wife, my kids, and maybe my kids' teachers are the only people I talk to. I mean, that happens a lot. So it is strange. I went from having sort of a vocation where my entire job was interacting with the world and sort of engaging with culture to a life where I'm almost more detached than like a factory employee. Because like I don't even have, at least a factory employee like has 4 people they talk to at lunch and like has to like, see the HR guy or whatever. It's like my life since moving to Portland is, I guess, more different than I anticipated. It's better than I anticipated, but also stranger.
Do you find that you're kind of stricken with any feelings of kind of loneliness, given that you spend a lot more of your time sort of interacting in a more insular way, kind of like you said?
I don't really experience loneliness. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I ever have. I mean, when I lived in Germany for like 5 months in 2008, I was teaching at the University of Leipzig. So I'm in East Germany, where obviously the language is German and the second language is Russian. That was probably as close as I ever came to feeling lonely. But even that did not seem as though to fit the way, at least sort of like the kind of the literary or cinematic definition of loneliness is. I mean, I find that the loneliest situations I've experienced were often when I was around people. I mean, because it's almost like if you're around people and you're not connecting with them, it really amplifies the kind of the alienation you have. Whereas if you're by yourself, especially now with the way technology operates, there are a lot of people in New York who my relationship with is completely the same as when I live there. I see them just as often, which is never, but I see what they write on Twitter, and I kind of see them because some people, sort of use Twitter as a way to sort of exist in the media sphere. There are, and it creates this kind of awkward condition where there are some people who aren't really at all involved with social media, and I miss them very much. And then there's some people who I never even liked that much to begin with, but I see them every day. Like I know everything going on in their life, but because I'm involved with reading the platform, I just sort of have to accept that there are now these people who I know everything about their day-to-day life, even though I've never cared once.
Yeah. It's amazing because I even have, very close friends that because we stay tethered digitally, and you realize that it's like you can go 2 or 3 years without seeing them, but not feeling like you haven't seen them. It's very unmooring in a way.
Well, it's the inverse of a certain kind of relationship that I used to experience in the 90s. Say when I was at college, I had some people in my life who I viewed as extremely close friends, like people that I assumed I would probably talk to pretty consistently for the rest of my life. But now I realize that actually our relationship was based around partying and just sort of going to the same venues and settings and watching the same sporting events and listening to the same music. And then when we moved away from that, period, it was like, well, I guess we didn't really have anything in common because we never really talked that much. We just sort of experienced things together. And now those people are kind of, these distant old friends that I don't really have any connection with. Whereas what happens now is you build these relationships around a specific kind of communication. It's not like talking on the phone. It's not like writing letters. It's not even really like writing email. It's just these sort of bursts of exchange that mark the passage of time. And I sometimes wonder if I ran into some of these people, if it would actually be awkward or if we would just talk the way we text, because that's kind of what our relationship is,
So growing up in North Dakota, I was curious as to maybe what and who you were reading at a young age that started to maybe click with you, that maybe, I know you said like the idea of being a writer as a vocation was so foreign to you at that time, but I wonder who you might have been reading at that time that maybe gave you the bug that this might be something you want to try doing.
Oh, well, like what age are you talking about?
I guess high school seems like a good starting point. Maybe a little younger, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting deal because there's like this period of my life in about 8th grade where I can remember what I was reading as clearly now as I can about like what I was reading 6 months ago. I don't know why that is. So, I mean, I guess to answer your question, it must have been around that time when somehow the meaning of reading changed to me. And I wasn't, that it somehow went from something that I just kind of liked to do or was kind of an escapist thing to something where I kind of cared about it in a way that my thinking changed. And you say, like, what was that? Well, I remember reading Animal Farm by George Orwell and Black Boy by Richard Wright and a biography of the basketball player Connie Hawkins. The book was called Foul. It was a long book for an 8th grader, I thought. And I read like these 3 books, and I read them one after another, and there was no real reason why. There was no explanation as to why I picked those books. Nobody gave them to me. I found them in the library, I guess. It's just an interesting thing. It's like as you become an adult and as you become sort of like a professional writer or whatever, you start thinking sometimes. You try not to think about the kind of person who reads your work, or you don't try to write for any kind of specific person generally. But when you think about it in your mind, you always sort of imagine this big kind of a pretty intelligent adult who's real discerning about, what they consume, and it's kind of a compliment if they like your work. And yet, in truth, the most meaningful things that I read all happened before I was 20 years old. I mean, it's like that really is the period of your life where reading shapes who you are as a person. So, as I've sort of seen as I've gotten older, that particularly like my first 3 books, they often now seem to be consumed by like senior in high school, freshman in college. And sometimes people will look at that as sort of a negative thing. Like these are books for people who haven't totally intellectually matured. But I love that. I mean, I think that the idea that these books could somehow play any role in someone's intellectual maturation, and maybe be the springboard for them to read things that are maybe a little more dense, or a little more sort of less voice driven and more sort of idea concerned. I mean, that's great to me. I mean, if that ends up being what that early part of my life is as a writer, I mean, that would be good to me.
Do you find that people who read your work, maybe younger writers or aspiring writers or struggling writers of any kind, might discount the amount of reading that you really have to do to be able to forge a good argument and to bolster what it is that you do? I think a lot of your work feels so conversational and stream of consciousness, but anybody who does this kind of work knows that there takes a tremendous amount of research and reading that goes into it. So I wonder if maybe you run across people that might discount the amount of reading one has to do this well.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, if that's what they're discounting about me, fine. That doesn't bother me. If somebody like that, that's like how like if someone perceives my writing as like, well, he can do this without reading anything else. I don't know. That almost seems like a compliment. I don't know. It's a strange thing. There is like a kind of a cliche you're supposed to say when you're a writer and somebody asks you about writing. You're supposed to go, read as much as you can, read constantly, never stop reading, every minute of your life, read. It's like, and there's like, of course, well, that's good. Reading is good. It's an enriching experience. But I will say this, that if the more you read and the more you think about what you're reading from a structural, technical perspective, the more your writing is going to move in this somewhat homogeneous direction. I mean, that is true. I can't say that for everybody, but sometimes I do think that if you consume other people's work, which you have to do to understand the world, the one downside is it does make you more like the rest of the world. And what I'm trying to do, at least, like, I mean, this is like I don't know if this always sounds so ungrateful or something, or weird to say this, but very often when someone writes about your work or reviews your work, they'll compare you to another writer. And it's almost always supposed to be a compliment, okay? And it's because it's often somebody who is like more canonical or has, is sort of established themselves as great, and someone saying like, well, this person is also good. They're kind of like this person who's great. But I have to say, it never feels like a compliment to me. Like, I don't want anyone to think I'm like a different writer, even if that writer is way better than me. I mean, the kind of joke I always use about this is like, if you start a rock band and someone says to you, it's like, oh, you're great. You're like Led Zeppelin. Like, they're complimenting you, but that's only a compliment if you're in a Led Zeppelin cover band.
Right.
Like, I don't want to be like other. I mean, that is something that's, it puts you in this kind of awkward position where I do think a lot of writers, and particularly a lot of novelists and fiction writers, do have a desire to sort of become the work they have loved, and to sort of, it's like I've talked to people who like they love Philip Roth or whatever, and they're like, they basically want to write a novel that's like a Philip Roth novel, and I don't feel that. I'm not criticizing that as a perspective because that's kind of a formal way of looking at writing. Like, there's a way this can be done that is, from my perspective, perfect, and these other people have sort of perfected this craft, and I want to be part of that craft. But I'm not like that. I don't feel that way. And I sometimes worry that it's like the most egocentric, kind of narcissistic thing to think, that the only work I want to do has no relationship to any other influence. But I definitely do feel that way.
Yeah, you said that you've come to the conclusion that you don't want to become a writer. Well, you don't become a writer until you don't want to be influenced by other people, or that's when it starts.
Yes, absolutely.
Are we always sort of becoming then? Like, is there a point where you have felt that you have, or at what point did you feel that maybe you broke free of people that you were being compared to?
Well, I mean, I don't know. That's a harder question because it's not the people who I think I went through phases of wanting to be like aren't really the people I get compared to that much. I mean, it's when Killing Yourself to Live came out, there's just a ton of articles and reviews that would compare me to like Hunter S. Thompson. But all the person was doing was saying like, well, okay, this is a kind of a journalist, but it's a different kind of journalism, and he does drugs, and sometimes he's funny, and sometimes it's not funny. I'm going to say this is like Hunter S. Thompson as a form of shorthand, which also just sort of allows anybody reading that article to go like, he is not as good as Hunter S. Thompson. It's like when someone compares you to someone, it also does sort of create this situation that anybody can then hear that and like you less because somebody else pretended you were like someone else. But I don't think there was ever a time where I wanted to be like Hunter S. Thompson. If there was, I don't remember it. When Fargo Rock City had come out, it was the same thing. There was like they used the like Greil Marcus and Lester Bangs because they're like the two rock critics people know of who don't follow rock criticism. I don't really think my work is similar to either of those guys. I mean, doesn't seem similar in any way to me, but the comparison gets made. And then once the comparison gets made, it's almost partially true because a lot of people will just sort of accept what somebody else that they assume knows if they assume the other person knows what they're talking about, this must be the case. I mean, like for me, it was just different. I would just go through these periods where it's like, oh, I think the last one was David Foster Wallace. I think was the last person I remember reading, and I was like, boy, I wish I could produce anything that's like this. And then that just kind of faded, and then it never happened again.
I love this passage from Eating the Dinosaur where you say, sometimes writing is difficult. Sometimes writing is like pounding a brick wall with a ball-peen hammer in the hope that the barricade will evolve into a revolving door. Sometimes writing is like talking to a stranger who's exactly like yourself in every possible way, only to realize that this person is boring as shit. And I love that because I've rarely heard you refer to writing as like hard work and like laboring through it. And I was wondering if maybe you could speak to that in terms of the work that goes into forging these things that are, exclusively, from your own head and your own pen, so to speak.
Well, okay. First of all, among all those things that I compare it to, also sometimes writing is kind of fun. I think that it is a pretty fun way to live. I can't believe that this is my life, that I have been paid as much money as I have to do this thing, which as far as I can tell, does not really give that much to society. That seems to be, like I'm getting more from society than I'm giving back. Also, just, I mean, not to make it sound like I'm Laura Ingalls Wilder or something, but like growing up in my hometown, there is nobody in my hometown who has a job as easy and lucrative as mine. I don't, not only a few people, nobody, not one person. I mean, it's just like the way that my family lives and works. It is, so it's hard for me to look at writing as difficult. But that said, of course it's not easy. Like, it would be weird if it was easy. Everybody would do it if it was easy. Yeah. There is something hard about, building your entire life around being creative and having to come up with creative ideas all the time. And then to also know that you're doing something that sort of exists in this odd paradox. It's like, you're supposed to be an artist fundamentally for yourself, and you're not supposed to think about how that art is being consumed by other people, because that will affect the way you build it and the way you make it. That you somehow need to separate that. And yet your ability to do that as a living is dependent on other people liking it. And also, writing is a communicative art. So if you're not communicating ideas, you're not very good at the art you're trying to do. So you're in this weird situation where you constantly have to look at the writing you're doing as the single most important thing that exists in the world, while simultaneously realizing it doesn't matter at all. And that's a strange kind of cognitive dissonance, but it's the only way to make it work. And, someone will ask you a question about, like, what do I need to think about if I'm a writer? If I talk to a college and it's a writing class, I feel like I'm constantly giving them advice that is literally impossible to do. You can't do it. You can't make yourself believe two opposing things on purpose.
Mm. Yeah, it's tricky that you have to try to divorce those things, especially when you're. I've heard you speak that your strategy is always to be like maybe one or two steps ahead of the reader. So in a sense that as they're reading that sentence, it feels like they are writing it out of their own mind. And,
yes.
And that is incredibly, I can't imagine how hard that is to do. But at the same time, you are able to divorce, your own writing, but then you ultimately always have this reader in mind. So that is incredible.
Well, yeah, I mean, when people ask what I spend the most time on, I spend the most time on making my writing more clear and more straightforward. Because I do what you just said is absolutely true. I guess I've said it a bunch of times, so maybe it's just the thing I say. But I always am trying to make the person who's reading my work feel as though that they are writing what they're reading with their own mind, and to make them feel almost like, I could have done this. Like, he did it first, but I could have done this. I think that in a certain respect, that's what people, when they feel when they say they connect with a piece of writing, it's, in a way, I think that's just our natural sort of kind of self-focused human nature is. It's like you feel as though the thing you're reading is something that came from you as much as another person. And of course, that is an illusion. That is kind of a trick. But I think it's a beneficial trick to all involved. I mean, you know what I'm saying? I think it makes everyone like the process more, except maybe for me.
I love an introduction to the interview you gave with Jonathan Franzen in your book 10. And what struck me about that introduction is something I've never heard you speak to before, was almost this kind of professional jealousy, because he's the one person you've interviewed who's actually kind of doing the same thing you're doing, but he, as you said, is more respected as an American novelist and everything. And I was wondering how you process those feelings of competition and jealousy among peers, and as it came through in that little intro essayette on Franzen.
Well, yeah, it's like it would be weird if I was jealous of Kobe Bryant when I interviewed him. That'd be it would make no sense. Or Eddie Van Halen or something. I don't play any instrument. I'm jealous of this guy because he can play guitar. That makes no sense. With writers, it is different. And that was an example where I'm talking to somebody, and it's like there's just kind of this weird power relationship because, you know, from a distance of 2,500 miles or whatever, we're doing the same thing. Or, you know, to somebody who doesn't care about books or writing, there's not any difference between us. And yet within the small world of writing, there's a vast amount of difference. So vast, in fact, that it would be like insane to imagine Jonathan Franzen interviewing me. Like that would be that could never happen, right? I mean, writers are jealous people. I'm a jealous person. I try not to be, but I am. Almost every writer I know is, because we have almost, without trying, we have created a really problematic relationship. I guess this is true for all art, which is that there are two ways to be successful. You can be successful in a commercial sense because your work is purchased and that you're like a success in that way and sort of the traditional way, or you can be a success among your peers, which is usually built on the idea that you're not that successful and people don't realize how good you are, and maybe you're not successful because you're so good that the average person doesn't really get it, which means no matter what happens, you're probably going to be deficient in one of these two categories. Now, Franzen is a little different. Franzen is one of the rare people who is extremely commercially successful and extremely appreciated and well respected. Although you can see this has happened just because we've sort of democratized the way media works. Jonathan Franzen is one of the most criticized people on a platform like Twitter, of which he is not involved with. But I mean, if I went on Twitter right now and put Jonathan Franzen into the search and I looked up what people were saying, it would mostly be negative. Or it would be people criticizing the kind of person who thinks Franzen is good or whatever. It's this strange thing. It's really difficult to be a writer and feel satisfied about both of those components, to the point where I don't know if I have met more than, I think, one guy. I would say, I'm thinking in my mind, I can only go one person who seemed, as far as I could tell, pretty comfortable in both of those silos, you know? So it's going to really sort of spur jealousy and envy because you're always going to want the thing you don't have. Even if you look at like Franzen and David Foster Wallace, those guys were friends, and Wallace was definitely envious of Franzen's commercial success of like the corrections and stuff like that. And Franzen is definitely still, I think, a bit envious of the way Wallace is perceived, both as a writer, but also as just a guy who is like, oh, we love him so much. He's such a wonderful person, you know? So even guys like that are kind of shackled with this jealousy.
Mm. Yeah, it's I almost feel like there's probably an element in Franzen, and I could never know this, but the fact that he's famous in part because he was friends with David Foster Wallace for a while, and they had this competitive sort of friendship.
Yeah, although that really wasn't a component of his fame. I mean, you could say that like Franzen's fame did really kind of explode by not going on the Oprah Winfrey show. Right. That I think that sort of it made a lot of people have suddenly an opinion about the guy who'd never really thought of him before. People who had never read that book were like, oh, I get that. Or like, that's terrible. He should be thankful. You know, it's like, I think that just kind of his public posture in a way, that he could be on the cover of, like, I don't know if it was Time or Newsweek. He was on the cover of one of those. And it's hard to imagine that happening now. I mean, if it did, it would be for some secondary reason. It would be like the guy from Game of Thrones or like J.K. Rowling or something being on the cover, and it wouldn't just be about the fact that they're a writer. It's that this has moved into some other aspect of culture. Also, now that we're talking about this, I guess it wouldn't happen because do Time and Newsweek still exist as publications, as print? I don't think Newsweek does. Time might, but as I am.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
But like, it wouldn't matter. Like, it's like now anybody could be like, when publications get so small like that, they could put anybody on there. It's like, who gives a shit, you know?
Right. I want to circle back to this thing that you said just about writing being pretty damn fun. And when I was reading Raised in Captivity, I felt like you were having a lot of fun writing these stories it's such a great collection of stories where really the ideas you're coming across seem to be the main character of all of them. And then you have all these little characters in there that are just kind of the foils that allow the idea to stand tall. So like, what was your relationship to writing these stories? Because it did seem like you were having a really good time doing them.
Well, I mean, this will sound like something a guy says when he's promoting a book, but this is just true. This is the most fun I've had writing a book since Fargo Rock City. And it's not even close. I mean, like Fargo Rock City, basically, I wrote with no belief that it would ever be published. I was just doing it because it's like I was living in Akron and I had a computer for the first time and I didn't have any friends and I was like, I wonder if I can do this, you know, and like that was super fun. And then after that, it was just different levels of oh, it's like, what does it mean that I'm doing this? Or is this good enough? Or will people like this? Or should I care that people like this? Or is this up to my standard and all these things, you know? And I had wanted to do this kind of this anthology of fiction for a while. What I would do is, like anytime I had like some weird idea or like a weird bit of dialogue or something, I would just put it into my phone in like the notes function. Mm-hmm. And I had like hundreds and hundreds of like sentence fragments. And then I just used those sentence fragments to sort of come up with ideas for these stories. And they were short, the original plan, I don't know why I had this plan. I feel stupid talking about it now, but it's true. The original plan was that I was going to write 100 stories that were all exactly 1,000 words long. Mm. That was my formalist fucking dream or whatever, So I start trying to do that, and it doesn't. Every story is either being kind of fleshed out to get up to 1,000, or I'm cutting stuff out to get down to 1,000. I start realizing it's like, well, when this book gets edited, I'm going to have to go back in and make sure all these stories, what if I mistype or something and I got to figure out a way to get these back to 1,000 or whatever. No one's going to care that I did this. Literally no one's going to buy a book because it's like, oh, did you hear about this book? Every story is the exact same length or whatever. So then I scrapped that idea. And prior to that, when I was actually trying to do this was like a terrible writing experience because everything about it was based around this made up obstruction. And then when I said, I'm just going to write these whatever length they should be, it was great. It was just fun. Like it was pure writing in the way that I just hadn't done. I mean, I guess professionally ever. Like, I don't think I've ever been sometimes, I guess there's some parts of Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs, I guess, are a little like that, where I was just like, oh, I'm just going to write this and see what happens or whatever. But for the most part, that's not how it works, Like, it's just, for the most part, you're not writing without the idea that at the end, there should be something that people take away or get or feel that's very specific. And that if they don't take that away from this piece of writing, the writing has failed. And that's not how it is with this. I mean, this was just fun. In fact, like, if I could do this, if I could write books like this one for the rest of my life, that's what I do. But that's not a reasonable thing to do. I mean, that's not. Also, eventually it would get repetitive and everything gets boring eventually. But right now, that's how it feels.
At what point did you land on this idea of writing a short story collection that is basically written like nonfiction stories?
Well, I don't like the way most fiction is. Mm-hmm. And I'm not criticizing it. I'm not in any way saying that everyone's bad at fiction and I will do it right. That's not what I mean. I just don't like the way it's written for me. Like, I like reading nonfiction. I like the experience of how nonfiction works. And when I read fiction, I very rarely feel that way because even when I look at the two novels I wrote, I think that that I thought in my mind, it's like, well, this is a different modality. There's got to be something different about this. There's like certain things fiction needs to do and all, and at some point I was like, well, why do I think this? Like, no one told me that. Like, I have been socialized to believe that this is how it's supposed to be. And, it's like, I'll start like, I would say, like an embarrassingly high number of novels I do not finish, not because I'm not interested or I'm too lazy. It's like, this is a waste of my time the way this is coming across. Like, this does not feel like a practical use of my time. And I suspect, sadly, that this is partially due to the influence of the internet. I do think the internet has changed the way most people, maybe all people read, certainly has changed the way I read. And I guess I just kind of concluded, it was like, well, I don't know. This is maybe the best way to describe it. I think that very often when anybody is writing a book, they lose track of the fact, or they forget that the book can be whatever they want. That, like, you're literally creating your reality. That doesn't have to be the way other books are. It just doesn't have to. It seems like it has to. And there's some sort of kind of non-spoken cultural pressure to have things be the way they've been before, or that there's a style that you use when you're doing one thing and a different style when you're doing something else. And that's just how it is. And I guess I finally got to the point where, like, I don't think that way now. It's like I write fiction and nonfiction the same way, which is just the way I do it.
Do you think that you have that kind of creative liberty at this point in your career because you're a famous writer with some notoriety, that you can kind of cash in on that and write fiction in the way that you see fit and not in some sort of market shoebox, or a market corner that maybe someone else with that panache can kind of can be that creatively bold, if you will?
Yes, that's absolutely true, and it's fucked up, but that's true. I mean, it's sort of like if you're a new writer trying to convince a publishing house to kind of to publish your new work, what the publishing house, of course, will say is that we're looking for the new voice, we're looking for the new thing, we're looking for what's never been done before or whatever. And 99.9% of the time, if they get that, they say no. Because they also have a different pressure. They have the pressure of selling these books, and that they are a business, and that they're a business that's involved with art, but it's still a business. It's safer for somebody who they know has, I don't know, a small following or a cult following, or wherever you look at it, because their audience, might be more receptive to this, and they can take the risk. They can be like, well, maybe this is actually great, and it will kind of spill into a whole different, a sector, or whole different kind of class of readership. It's weird. But like I did a story on U2 once, and Bono, of course, was talking in his Bono-like way, but he said something that I think is true. He's like, U2 has more freedom than a band playing in their garage to no one. Because it's like a band playing in their garage to no one. It's like they can't play forever. They got to go to work the next day. And like they've all these limitations. And it's like they got to find these other ways to live and make money and all that stuff. Whereas U2 can actually do whatever they want. He was like, this is not like some, I don't know, it's a golden bird cage or whatever. He's like, that's not how it is. He's like, it's that having success gave them more freedom. Now, obviously, I'm not nearly as successful as U2 in any context, even if you sort of adjust music and writing or whatever. It's like not even close. But it does seem as though that if I want to try something, somebody wants me to try it. I mean, I feel pretty supported. I don't feel as though I have an adversarial relationship with anybody in the publishing industry.
And do you find that your nonfiction, and because you're writing from a similar just artistic platform, that your nonfiction and this fiction kind of talk to each other in a way? I'm thinking of the story Execute Again, and also something you wrote about Mike Leach and the read option and voyeurism in Dinosaur, eating the dinosaur, and then like Visible Man, and then there's a cults. A cult story in your Raised Against Captivity, but you also wrote about like Waco and Cobain. So I wonder, like, if some of that fiction, well, that nonfiction was like, well, if I'm able to twist this into something fictional, that's the inspiration for this, and this is the kind of fun I can have when I break free of the nonfiction mold.
I mean, okay, I don't really know what you mean when you say talk to each other. I know what people mean when they say that, but in a real term, I'm not really sure. But yeah, I mean, I guess for like, yes, in that sense that, I mean, and I can't be the only person who thinks this about their own writing or whatever, but like I've written now, like, okay, it's 11 books. You know, if you don't count the anthologies, it's 9 books or whatever, but it feels to me like I'm writing one very long book. Like it does. I mean, in a lot of ways, my central interests have never changed. Like my specific interests have changed, but sort of like the abstract things that interest me are always, the same questions are just always there. I guess someone could hear this and be like, well, that kind of proves that he's uncreative. And I don't know, maybe that is the case. I mean, or that I have not evolved as much as someone should. That's also possible. I don't know. But I mean, yeah, what you're saying is true. I mean, I think it's really odd, in fact, when people are like, well, it's very common to say, like, I like his nonfiction, I don't like his fiction or whatever. I have no idea why somebody would feel that way. It doesn't make any sense to me. I could see someone liking both of them or disliking both of them. It seems odd, though, that they would like one and not like the other. I just don't know why, but,
Yeah, I wonder if that is for people that like to read strictly nonfiction. They know that there's a certain contract, and then you're playing on a certain field, and then saying these certain things with the contract of nonfiction, and then maybe that voice bleeding over into fiction. Then they don't know what is fact versus imagination or something. That might be.
I think it's more this. I mean, the fact of the matter is like even a bad nonfiction book is not a waste of time. Where bad fiction is a waste of time in a lot of ways. I mean, like if somebody reads one of my nonfiction books and like they don't like it, they might be like, well, at least I know how the first Steely Dan record was recorded now. Or like, or it's like, or, oh, well, now I learned this weird thing about dinosaurs or whatever. It's like, you can still get information from it. Like if you watch a real boring documentary, it is much more enriching than watching a really boring like rom-com, because if nothing else, you can say like, well, I went to class today. So I think maybe some people view that with like, why we've become such a nonfiction culture. I mean, the whole culture is nonfictional now. And I think it's because one of the things the internet has done to the way people read is that it's now much more common for someone not to look at reading as enjoyable or enriching or somehow, improving the way they think. It's like they want the information. Like I'm reading because the world is crazy and there's so much access to information now that in order to be competitive, I got to just know what's going on. So I'm not going to read horizontally. I'm going to read vertically and give me as much to read as you can in the next 40 minutes. And I'm going to try to read as much as I can and get as much information so I can move on. And if I have a conversation with somebody, I can talk about, what's happening in the Sudan, or like, what do I think about, Camilla Harris or whatever. It's like they don't think of it as something that is supposed to be enjoyable. That's how they think about television.
Yeah, that's too bad, because I still will consume reading as my escape, as a way to be entertained. Like when I read an essay of yours, before bed, or one of these stories that I've read a few times, it's just like, oh, that's my bite of goodness and fun. Like I don't need information to be consumed that way.
Yeah, and the people, I'm guessing, listening to this podcast are like you. Like the person who's listening to this podcast has probably just heard what I said and said, well, that's not true. I'm not like that. Right. You're probably not like that. It's like the people who would see this podcast and be like, I don't know. I don't need to hear a writer talk about himself. Yeah.
And when you were, something you said, like that you were corralling all of these sentence fragments and dialogue fragments and everything into your phone and forming those into what might ultimately become a story. What was that process like of getting those and then curating those and then trying to sort of garden those so they bloomed into something that you were proud of? What was that routine like?
Well, okay. That's a good question. Part of the reason that I wanted to do this project now, or maybe I guess part of the reason I did this project now, even though I've maybe wanted to for years, is the way it fit in to the way my life temporarily is. I mean, right now, my days are incredibly regimented. And weirdly, it turns out I like this. I spent my whole life thinking I wanted freedom. As it turns out, I like kind of living in my own kind of self-made prison or whatever, But it's like, it doesn't seem like prison to me. It's actually the way I like to live. So, my days are that my son wakes up at about 5:45, and I get up and I, let him watch Ninja Turtles or whatever. My daughter gets up at about 6 or 6:15. Then I make them breakfast, get them dressed, take them to school, get home at about 8:45 or 9. I go to the gym for 1 hour. I take a shower. I eat lunch at 10:30, and then I go out to my office from 10:45 till 5, which is then I go back to get them from school. So from that period of time, that's all I have. Okay. I can't write at night anymore. I can't write on weekends. I got that block of time. So I was like, I'm going to write a bunch of stories that are exactly 1,000 words long, because the way this will work is on, on Monday, I will kind of start writing the piece. On Tuesday, I will finish writing the piece. On Wednesday, I will go back and edit a story from last week. On Thursday, I will go back and edit the story that I wrote on Monday and Tuesday. And then on Friday, I'll start planning what I'm going to do next week. And that's how I did it. So I basically wrote a story a week. Like there's 34 stories in this collection. I think I wrote 55 of them. So I basically wrote a story a week for about a year. Yeah. In kind of a weirdly mechanical way. Like when I say it like that, it actually seems the opposite of how I always kind of viewed creativity working. Because before I had kids, and certainly like before I was in a relationship, like I wrote whenever I was moved to write. So I would maybe write, I would start writing at 11 o'clock at night on a Friday night or whatever. Or I would just, whenever I felt like now I want to write, I'm going to do it. But what I found is that this limitation sort of prompted me to be like, okay, you're writing fiction, but you're doing it the way that you used to do when you worked at a newspaper, which is you do the interview, you transcribe the interview, you do the interview, you transcribe the interview, you do any other secondary interviews you need, you write the piece, you return the piece in. It's like I guess I operate well in that sort of system,
Yeah, I read that at times, sometimes you would start writing at midnight and write till 4, and then when you had a relationship and a family, these walls get put up. But it's like what Jocko Willink says, like discipline equals freedom. It's kind of amazing. Like if you have this block, it's kind of amazing what you can get done when you know that is all you get for that day.
Absolutely. It's like, and it's things that people have always said, and yet you never believe them. Like I never really believed it I would have never made myself do that. There's nothing I could have ever read or heard that would have made me said, okay, I'm going to write 6 hours a day, 5 days a week at the same time. I would have never done that. It's only when I was forced to. But it's just this, it's one of these weird, nobody wants to be forced to do anything. And yet when you look back on your life, what were the most satisfying things? Very often things you were forced to do. I would never have had kids if my wife didn't want them. It's the greatest thing that has ever happened to me. It is the most profound thing and almost like the most typical way. And everybody I ever knew who had kids said that, and I thought they were all lying. I just assumed that's what they said. I just assumed that these people were saying how profound it was, and I was like, well, yeah, your life is terrible, so you got to say this to kind of compensate. It isn't that way. It actually is the greatest thing, and I just, I'm 47 years old now, and it's just amazing to me how I'm still constantly realizing how many things I've been wrong about my whole life. And I just can tell it's never going to stop. That I'm going to be 88 years old being like, oh my God, why did I, it's like, I just know it's going to happen.
Mm. And when you were writing these stories, let's say, where do you feel most alive and most engaged in that process? The generation or maybe the rewriting and the editing phase?
Oh, the initial typing. Mm-hmm. Typing it for the first time. Always. It's like you write a sentence and you're like, that's perfect. That's great. And then you look at it again later and you're like, yeah, it's good. Maybe it could be better. And then you work on it more and you actually make it better, but it seems worse. And then it becomes part of something larger and you read the whole large thing and you're like, God damn it, that's terrible. And it comes out, it's actually published and you hate it and you're embarrassed by it. And people say they like it, and you're like, you must be an idiot if you think that's good. And then you don't look at it for 2 years. And then 2 years later, you look back on it and you go, that's a good idea. I wish I'd been a better writer 2 years ago. I wish I could have that idea now. That's how I often feel about stuff. It's like I don't really go back and read what I wrote because it just drives me crazy. But every so often, I'll have to go back and, somebody will want something I'd written for for a textbook or something like that. So I got to always go back and check. And the feeling I always have is like, boy, that was actually an original idea. Like, that's not me stealing somebody else's idea. That was my own idea. Like, that's real new. Boy, though, I wish I could have written it better. Like, I could really write that idea well now. The only problem is I could never have that idea now because I've been exposed to too many other smart people who have given me so many ideas that I can't really think of anything on my own.
What would you say you're better at now than you were even 5 years ago?
From a technical perspective, everything. My writing is much more concise now. I am much less likely to include a bad idea just because it's interesting. I use parentheses less. I use semicolons less. I use footnotes less. I think that I am more aware of how at times the amount of voice I use can actually detract from the experience of reading. The thing I'm not as good at is I have become more like other writers. I can just tell that. I moved to New York and I met some of the most interesting, brilliant people that I've ever encountered. I would never give up that experience. It's like just the people at Spin Magazine were just some of the people who I just really changed the way I thought about everything, but as a consequence, it's like some of the sharp edges got ground down in a way because now I second guess myself in a way that I didn't when I was younger. Like one thing I've noticed people who I don't know, I don't want to criticize this, but some people will go to creative writing MFA programs and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And I'll talk to them about the experience. And it often seems to have made the person a less confident, less interesting writer. Because what happens is they write a piece and then you have 10 people workshop it. And the 10 people who are workshopping it feel an obligation to say something about it, something positive and something negative, just a normal reaction. And what's often going to happen is that the things that they pick out are the things that just fall outside of the typical norms of writing. Anything that they notice that seems different than what they would have done or most writers would have done. And I see that these guys, and these women remove those things from their writing. And by the time that they're finished, it's almost like all that person and the 10 people who critique them, they're like 11 copies of each other now.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's why a lot of fiction to me, it seems like it was almost made by like a collective computer in a way. Yeah. And that happened to me a little bit just from being in New York because, I used to have really bold, strong opinions, and I'm not really like that anymore because I've now met so many really smart people with, kind of contradictory ways of thinking about the world that I think about all those people anytime I have an opinion now. Like I just, and it ends up moving everything kind of toward the middle. I do wonder sometimes that if I had never left Akron, if I had just stayed in Akron, if I would be like a worse thinker, but a better writer. Because I wonder if maybe my writing would be more unique.
Do you share your work with anybody at all?
Well, not till it's pretty close to being done. My wife reads it. I have a friend who's a librarian in Akron, Ohio, named Bob Ethington. He's read almost everything I have written before it's published in terms of books. And then I have a kind of a collection of friends who are writers who usually do read, like not all of them, but some of them. I kind of will think, well, like this is the person who should be reading this, or this is the person who could give me insight on that. And sometimes it's helpful. With nonfiction, it can be helpful because the main thing you're doing is you're giving it to someone and saying, what parts of this do you just feel are false and tell me why? Or like, are there any things that I'm just missing that are going to be obvious to anybody who understands this topic and stuff like that? Or, just this, all like nonfiction writing is a little closer to bowling in the sense that like you can be perfect. Like you can do a story or an essay that's just perfect. It's like there's nothing, it's not missing anything, With fiction, if you have someone read it, I basically have one question, which is tell me what parts are boring. Because that's the only thing that really matters. Everything else is subjective. Like I want to know what part you couldn't get through. I don't really care what you thought about the other parts as long as they were interesting enough for you to finish.
And in terms of boring in your fiction, do you like the short story form because there's greater economy and maybe less of a chance to be bored by a piece?
Well, yeah, that's part of it. I mean, also, it's like when I think of writing that I like or things that I read that I still remember, it has to do with like what was the idea in the story. I am not super obsessed with character development and like plot mechanics. I appreciate those things when I read it, like especially plot mechanics. Sometimes you'll read a book and you'll be like, boy, this is a different kind of skill than I have. I mean, this is like like they just know how to engineer the way a story moves. But I like things where it's like, well, you read the story and you come away with an idea. And a short story can do that in a way that is a little more efficient because you don't really have time. The character can't really change in 1,400 words or something. It's like, or if they change, they can change once. And there can't be too many plot mechanics. And if they are, you're just going to be describing what they are. And that's not really supposed to be part of it. Uh, so that's probably what it is. I mean, like, you maybe remember a story when you read when you were young, the Lady and the Tiger. Do you remember that story?
Yes, a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, where a woman has to choose between two doors, and behind one door, she's basically choosing which door her boyfriend will open. And if he opens one door, it'll be a different woman who he'll get to marry. And if it's the other door, it'll be a tiger who will eat him. So she'll either have to save his life, but watch him kind of fall in love with this other person, or he'll be consumed in this horrific situation. In a lot of ways, I always think of that as like the perfect story, because it's like it's set in a time that is also timeless. Like, it's set in the past, but you don't really know exactly when in the past it's supposed to be happening. You imagine it's probably kind of in the gladiator period, but there's, it's like, doesn't necessarily have to be. It has a central question about what are your real feelings? And then it has an unclear ending. So it allows the consumer to kind of think about both answers. That is the kind of thing that I love. Or like these stories in this book, whenever someone says, what are they like? In my mind, they're kind of like episodes of The Twilight Zone, where we're like, when you watch The Twilight Zone, it was the idea is the book or the story or the show. Like, the idea is everything. It's not even how the thing necessarily unspools or how deftly it's kind of woven together. It's like, this is the idea, and it hinges on one change. I guess that's what I like. I'm describing this in a way I guess I've thought about but never really said, but I guess this is kind of how I feel.
Yeah. Oh, they're great stories. I love them. I read the book cover to cover, and then I read several of them over again, some of my favorite ones, and it was great fun to be able to dive into this. And is there anything else you'd love to add about this book in particular, or do you feel like you've kind of said all you wanted to say about it?
Well, I'll say this: we're doing the audio book for it now, cool. And this is very kind of exciting to me because it's like, okay, there's first-person stories and there's third-person stories, and I am reading the third-person stories, and the first-person stories are being read by different people, and it's like this fascinating collection of people. It's like Brent Musburger reads one, Kurt Loder reads one, like Mike Birbiglia, my friend John Dolan, my wife. I think Chris Gethard's going to read one. Aisha Taylor, like maybe the guy who plays Pete Campbell from Mad Men is going to read a story. It's like, that to me is a real exciting thing. I imagine what it must be like. You're a playwright, and all of a sudden someone makes the play. Like it's fascinating to me to have this happen. The idea of Brent Musburger even knowing who I am, I can't believe that. That blows my fucking mind, Now, granted, he might not really know who I am. They may have just given him this pages, and he was like, okay, let's go. But still, it's like they haven't. Like, it's not done yet. They're still actually, because we're recording this in June, they're like still doing it. So maybe when this comes out, it'll be done. But I'm looking forward to listening to that.
Yeah, me too. Geez, as much as I've read this and will continue to read it, I want to get the audiobook now just to have that different kind of experience. Like you said, like it's like a screenwriter then watching the Avengers, then, act out your screenplay.
Sure. It's like, okay, so I've been very lucky in my life that it seems as though that something that if people like my writing or think it's okay, they kind of like the voice in it. But now sometimes with fiction, they feel there's too much voice. That it seems like every character is me. That's what they said about Downtown Owl. every character is just him talking or whatever, which is kind of true because I fucking wrote them all. It wasn't me who did it. I came up with it. But anyways, some people don't like that. So now with these first person stories particularly, it will not be my voice. It will be a different voice. And I wonder if people will hear these stories differently than people who read them. Because, you know, I've done like a lot of podcasts and stuff like that now. And I mean, I realize that some people hate my voice. They like not the voice I wrote with, the voice I actually speak with.
And like, then they can't unhear it when they read it.
Exactly. I know. I sometimes wish I would have never done any of these things. That I've never. I'm serious. That I'd never done a podcast. That I'd never gone on TV. That, you know, because here's the deal: if writing has a lot of voice, and the person doesn't know the voice of the author, they create the best version of their own voice. Like if writing has a lot of voice, but they don't know who the author is, they just kind of use their own voice in the best possible context, and that's what they hear. But once they know the voice, you can't swing back. Like, I defy anyone to read a Malcolm Gladwell book now and not hear Malcolm Gladwell's voice. I don't think it's possible. Like, it just can't be done. You know?
Absolutely. Yeah, and what a great strategy, too, to have you read the third-person stories, because then it further divorces the first person, and thus like making it feel more like you reading that story, and the characters are you. So that's a great strategy for the audiobook too.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Chuck, you've been so generous with your time. I really appreciate you carving out the time to do this. Best of luck with the book, and I hope to do this again sometime, maybe when the next one comes out.
Anytime, man.
Fantastic. Take good care. We did it, guys. We did it. Thanks to the incomparable Chuck Klosterman. And to our sponsors, Goucher College's MFA in Nonfiction and Bay Path University's MFA in Creative Nonfiction. Check them out, visit their websites, see what works for you. Go buy Chuck's latest book. He's got a book tour going. He's going to be up in Portland in early August. Hopefully we can fist bump. Visit chuckklostermanauthor.com and say hi on the Twitters @CKlosterman. Right there. Of course, keep the conversation alive on Twitter by pinging the show @CNFpod. Share across your platforms. I'll jump in the fire and give you the horns and a skull. Let's riff. Also, sure to sign up for that monthly newsletter. Head over to BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey. For show notes, sign up for that newsletter. Hey, even consider leaving a review of the show. Whatever, we're all in this shit show together. I think that's it. We got to get out of here, man. Remember, if you can do, interview. See ya.